It would be a mistake to think that Celtic's 1970s was a straight downward trajectory from Milan in May 1970. It was a painful experience which cast a long shadow over the club for the rest of the decade, but there was no sense at the time that they would never again scale the heights in Europe, and by the beginning of 1972 there was every indication that a third European Cup final was well within Celtic's grasp. It had been an emotionally fraught 18 months, with more than half of the players who played in Lisbon saying their goodbyes, some more reluctantly and more bitterly than others, but several of the Quality Street gang were now firmly established in the first team, and together with the remaining experienced players, who included Tom Callaghan and Harry Hood, both signed before Milan, were producing a brand of exciting, attacking football as impressive as anything seen in the late 60s. The calendar year of 1972 opened with a 7-0 win over Clyde at Shawfield on the 1st of January, and for the first time in over a year, 21-year-old Danny Mcgrain took the field as a 50th minute substitute for Dixie Deans. He was the second Danny Mcgrain to touch the ball that afternoon, with his cousin of the same name turning out for Clyde. Celtic were already 5-0 up when Mcgrain came on, and by the end of play, their goals total against Clyde had reached 16 for the season after a 9-1 win at Celtic Park in September 1971. William Hunter's match report in the Glasgow Herald of the 3rd of January 1972 hints at a certain sympathy for Clyde, even as they were being eviscerated by a Celtic team on top form, at least on the part of former Clyde player Harry Hood. Clyde died well. 5 down at half-time, they came off in a condition of utter dejection. Their despair was so obviously total it was embarrassing. Entering the pavilion, Hood was moved to nudge Mulheron in the ribs in a gesture of unobtrusive sportsmanship that was part encouragement, part apology, and most moving. Hunter's summation that day, picking out Celtic's best performers, gives an indication of how the Celtic team was developing in the post-Milan era. Hood plotted brilliantly. Davidson's ball control was awesome. After the interval, when all was won, Callaghan performed from a box of tricks more to be expected in the circus ring than the soccer pitch. Above all, perhaps, there was Connolly, alternately a creative source of seemingly inexhaustible ideas or a granite tower of defensive strength as each situation demanded. Poor Clyde were only the appetiser before the main course 48 hours later as Rangers visited Celtic Park for the 4th clash of the Big Two that season, with Celtic having recorded 3 wins, all at Ibrox, in August and September. Rangers were already 7 points behind Celtic, who were only 2 ahead of their nearest challengers Aberdeen. Few gave Rangers much of a chance heading into the match, but although the scoreline turned out to be a lot closer than expected, it didn't stop Celtic recording a piece of history. Raymond Jacobs' match preview in the Glasgow Herald on the 3rd of January 1972 has a timeless quality to it. On paper at any rate, Celtic have the more skillful players in midfield and a greater flair in attack. Rangers will attempt to resist these assets with power and determination, and a defence which has conceded only 3 goals in the last 7 games, all of which they have won to take them into 3rd place and within 5 points of Aberdeen. Lou Macari was injured, but back into the Celtic team came Jimmy Johnston, who had been unable to play at Shawfield because of a bout of flu. In the wake of the departure of Tommy Gemmell, there was a question mark over the fullback positions, with Jim Craig and Jimmy Quinn having both been utilised there in recent weeks. But Jim Brogan was given the nod at left back and Davy Hay at right back. Once again, Danny Mcgrain was named as substitute ahead of Quinn. 1 year on from the tragedy at Ibrox, both teams wore black armbands and the flags flew at half-mast in memory of those who had lost their lives at the corresponding fixture the season before. The pattern of play was as the papers had predicted, Dalglish and Callaghan dictating play from midfield and playing the more sophisticated game, while Rangers, who started with 4 players up front, flung high balls at the Celtic defence for Colin Steen and Derek Johnston to chase. Raymond Jacobs wrote in the Glasgow Herald of the 4th of January 1972, Celtic thus made more chances for themselves, and before Johnston opened the scoring in 35 minutes, Deans, Lennox and Hood had all gone close. Apart from that, Rangers put themselves into difficulty by needlessly giving away free kicks in dangerous positions. It was from one of these that Celtic's first goal came, almost by way of being a punishment. From the left side of the arena, Hood flighted the ball to the far side, and there was Johnston standing completely unmarked so that he only had to stoop to conquer McCloy with his head. John Rafferty in The Scotsman that same day wrote, Rangers had marked the big men and left the little one clear. Celtic settled to play composed football in the second half, but Rangers wanted none of that and strove to stir up the action. It was a great contest. Celtic had the class, but Rangers worked to nullify it with honest endeavour. Celtic missed more chances in the second half, but seemed to be cruising to victory until Colin Steen grabbed an equaliser with 7 minutes remaining. Another long high through ball sent Steen and Willie Johnston running clear, and although Dennis Conaghan got 2 hands on Steen's fierce shot, it still trundled in with Tom Callaghan's despairing touch only helping it on. As the match wound down towards the draw that would have been an acceptable result for both teams, Celtic struck in the 2nd minute of injury time through the most unlikely of scorers. Raymond Jacobs reported, McNeil took a free kick, the ball came to Hood, and as he brought it under control, Brogan began a run into the area which he timed perfectly to infiltrate in front of McCloy to meet Hood's lob and glance the ball home. The man known as Crazy Horse understandably celebrated wildly with his ecstatic teammates. Unfortunately, his father, anxious to beat the full-time rush, had left his seat in the stand 5 minutes before and missed seeing perhaps the greatest moment in his son's career. Brogan's winner sealed Celtic's first league double over Rangers since 1912. There seemed little doubt now that Celtic would win the championship for a record-breaking 7th successive season, and next on the horizon was a European Cup quarter-final against the highly rated Hungarian champions Újpest Dózsa. They would knock Celtic out of the competition in the second round the following season and only lost to eventual winners Bayern Munich in the other semi-final when Celtic met Atletico Madrid at that stage in 1974. Before that quarter-final tie came around, another Lisbon Lion left the club when John Fallon, the substitute goalkeeper in Lisbon, was given a free transfer to Motherwell. As was covered in part 2 of this series, Gone Too Soon, both John Hughes and Tommy Gemmell felt a certain bitterness at the manner of their departures from the club, and both paint very unflattering pictures of Jock Stein in their autobiographies Lionheart and Yogi Bear. It's fair to say that their opinion of Steen is supported by Fallon, who by his own account in his autobiography, Keeping in Paradise, written with David Potter, had a fraught relationship with his manager over a period of many years. John Fallon was the quintessential post-war Celtic goalkeeper. On his day unbeatable, but prone to the occasional calamitous error, sometimes at the most inopportune moment. He made comparatively few appearances considering the length of his Celtic career, which began in the 1950s, but he played in some of the biggest occasions of the Steen years, including the 1965 Scottish Cup final, which kick-started a glorious era, the Alfredo Di Stefano testimonial in June 1967 that saw him lauded by the Real Madrid fans for a sensational display, the World Club Championship matches in South America in 1967 when he again excelled, and all of the triumphs of the treble-winning month of April 1969. It's difficult not to feel a great deal of sympathy with John Fallon over his treatment not just by Jock Stein but by the club itself. He relates a thoroughly embarrassing story of how he was deprived of the European Cup winners' medal that was his by right of being the only named substitute in Lisbon in Keeping in Paradise. Because of crowd problems, it was impossible for the whole team to collect their medals. We can all recall the problem that the much buffeted and battered Billy McNeill had getting across the pitch to collect the cup itself. The medals were therefore given to the team at the post-match banquet, 12 of them, one for each of the players and, of course, the substitute goalkeeper who was included in the 12. Billy informally handed them over. But then Jock Stein approached me and asked for mine back. I was told that I would be given another one in due course. This did in fact happen, but it was a replica medal struck by Celtic themselves in the same way as they have a replica of the European Cup in the stadium at Celtic Park. So my medal is not a real one. My real medal was given to no less a person than the chairman, Robert Kelly. Many supporters would have to rack their brains to find out what Robert Kelly did to deserve a European Cup medal. Fallon was reunited with his medal 52 years later, only after attention was drawn to the issue in October 2017 by a Twitter exchange between Fallon and Kelly's nephew, former Celtic director Michael Kelly. In response to a since-deleted tweet from Kelly stating, "I think to be a Lion you have to have played in Lisbon, no subs then," Fallon replied, "Excuse me, Michael, I was official sub-goalie, registered with Europe, and your uncle got my winner's medal taken off me by JS. The whereabouts of the medal in the years following Robert Kelly's death in 1971 can only be guessed at, no laughing at the back, but an article by Joe Donnelly on the club's official website, CelticFC.com, on the 29th of April 2019, gives a farcical account of how it came to be returned. Thought to have been lost after the European Cup final in 1967, John Fallon's medal was discovered by someone who recognised it as belonging to the Celtic goalkeeper who was on the bench in Lisbon. The medal was donated back to the club, and the club in turn made sure the medal was returned to its rightful owner. Celtic were praised for righting a wrong in the week of the sad passing of Billy McNeill and Steve Chalmers. But it's still shameful that John Fallon was deprived of what was rightly his for over 50 years by the club chairman and his family. For 27 of those years, members of the Kelly family retained seats on the Celtic board. Fallon also felt embittered by the way Jock Stein treated him as a player, feeling that he was frequently singled out for blame for defeats in a way the players around him were not. His Celtic career looked to be over after two nightmarish blunders gifted Rangers a point on the 2nd of January 1968, which looked to have cost Celtic the league in an incredibly tight race for the title. And Fallon writes in Keeping in Paradise that it was only the intervention of Robert Kelly that stopped Stein giving him a free transfer in the summer of 1968. Nevertheless, niggling injuries for Ronnie Simpson saw him feature frequently in season 1968-69, and after Simpson suffered a dislocated shoulder in a Scottish Cup match at Sheffield in February 1969, Fallon played his part in the treble success that followed. The Scottish Cup final of the 26th of April 1969, a 4-0 win over Rangers, was a moment of redemption for Fallon after that January 1968 nightmare. Jack Harkness wrote in his Sunday Post match report on the 27th of April 1969, A tremendous save by Fallon from Persson had me writing in my notebook that this save, perhaps even more than McNeil's goal, could prove the winning factor, because the save steadied a defence that hadn't been showing the same confidence as their attack. After criticising the Rangers forward line, Harkness then wrote, "Yet in fairness to Rangers' marksmanship, it must be recorded that John Fallon had several grand saves in the Celtic goal." The calendar year of 1969 was probably the best spell of John Fallon's Celtic career, as he was given an extended run as first-choice keeper, collecting 4 domestic winners' medals and performed brilliantly against AC Milan and Benfica in the European Cup. But just as he seemed to be finally established as first-choice goalkeeper, Evan Williams was signed from Wolves and shortly after replaced Fallon for the last match of the 1960s on the 27th of December 1969. Thus Fallon was once again substitute goalkeeper for the European Cup final in Milan in May 1970. He and Williams both had runs of games in the first half of season 1970-71, but Fallon was dropped after the 1-0 defeat to Aberdeen on the 12th of December 1970, and his appearances had been very fleeting since then. Fallon writes in Keeping in Paradise, "All managers need scapegoats, and Steen, who had never really liked me all that much in any case, saw perhaps in the changing of the goalkeepers a way in which the mob could be satisfied. In truth, neither Evan nor myself were outstandingly better than the other. I was possibly more agile and better at the difficult shots, whereas he was marginally better at cross balls and the more mundane tasks." A combination of illness and injury kept Fallon out of football for a long spell in 1971, and the signing of Dennis Conaghan signalled the end of his time at Celtic. On the 29th of February 1972, he was sold to Motherwell, very much against his will. Jim Blair wrote in the Evening Times that day, "The deal went through at Parkhead first thing this morning. There was no fee involved," said Celtic boss Jock Stein. "It was simply a case of cancelling John's registration with the club. He has been here since 1958 and has been a great servant to Celtic. Everyone here wishes him well with his new club." Fallon remembers in Keeping in Paradise, "On Monday the 28th of February, Steen had seen me at training but had said nothing. Then my great friend Bobby Murdoch approached me and said that he had heard a rumour about Motherwell being interested in me. I thought no more about it. Football grounds are always full of rumours. I then went home after training and had hardly entered the house when Jock Stein was at the door. The conversation was tense and difficult, but eventually I agreed reluctantly to leave Celtic Park and go to Motherwell." Of course, in 1972, there was no recognition that John Fallon was another Lisbon Lion to leave Celtic, but at least since the 25th anniversary of the European Cup triumph, all of the members of the first-team squad of 1966-67 have been regarded as Lions. In Fallon's case, he was even more unfortunate to have been left out for so many years. Maybe if substitutes were not still quite a novelty in the mid to late 60s, he would have been recognised as a Lion all along. Almost at the same time as John Fallon was being sent unceremoniously to Motherwell, Aberdeen seemed to run up the white flag in the league title race when they sold their 22-year-old captain Martin Buchan to Manchester United for a record fee received by a Scottish club of £135,000. The Dons lost to Partick Thistle at Firhill on the 4th of March 1972, the weekend before Celtic travelled to Hungary to play Újpest Dósa. The Evening Times of the 6th of March 1972 reported, "Success and Celtic aren't easily parted, which is why the Scottish League flag will fly over Parkhead for a record 7th successive time. Celtic used Saturday's game at Parkhead against Ayr United as a stepping stone to this unique position, while Aberdeen, the main championship challengers, fell at Firhill to a rejuvenated Partick Thistle. No team will overhaul Celtic, who are now 5 points clear at the top with a game in hand. This in itself is surely a clear indication of their marked superiority in Scottish football, or if you like, the distinct lack of top-class competition. Just how long is Celtic's monopoly going to last? The answer could well be, as long as Jock Stein is at Parkhead." On the back page of that day's edition, the Evening Times reported Celtic had trained in the morning before setting off for Prestwick Airport to catch their flight to Hungary, and that Saturday's 11 had been reinforced by Connaughton, Mcgrain, Quinn, Macari, Davidson, Wilson and McCluskey. All of the 6 outfield players mentioned were members of the Quality Street gang, and all had already made first-team appearances, although only Macari was as yet an established first-team player. For Danny Mcgrain, the trip to Hungary was the beginning of a rollercoaster few weeks that ended in disaster, and almost to the end of his playing career before it had properly begun. Neither Jim Craig nor Jimmy Johnston travelled to Hungary after bouts of flu and chickenpox respectively, so there was an opening at fullback for the match in Hungary, and Arthur Montford reported for the Scotsman of the 7th of March 1972. Steen made the surprise announcement this evening that he will give one of his younger players an opportunity to make a European Cup debut. He would not be drawn into saying who the player was, but it may well be fullback Danny Mcgrain, who has been in great form recently and who could come into the back four to let Davy Hay move forward into the middle of the field. Mcgrain's form recently could only have been in friendly matches and in the reserves. His only appearance so far that season was as a second-half substitute in the win at Shawfield, but he had previously given a string of impressive performances in the autumn of 1970 after making his debut as a substitute against Dundee United at Tannadice on the 26th of August 1970. After a masterful performance in Celtic's 2-0 win over Rangers at Celtic Park on the 12th of September 1970, John Rafferty wrote in the Scotsman of the 14th of September, "One did not notice that the international fullbacks, Craig and Gemmell, were missing. One wondered how this fine new young fullback Mcgrain could be displaced." Malcolm Munro, meanwhile, recorded in the Evening Times the same day, "Danny Mcgrain, another magnificent Celtic find at fullback, was never in any trouble." Mcgrain played at both right and left back over the next couple of months, but was not selected for the shock 1-0 defeat to Rangers in the League Cup final of the 24th of October 1970, and had then resumed his apprenticeship in the reserves. Now he was about to be thrown in at the deep end in the quarter-finals of the European Cup against the highly rated Hungarians, who had eliminated Leeds United from the Intercity's First Cup in 1969, as the Yorkshire team were setting a new points record in winning the English First Division. Malcolm Munro wrote in the Evening Times on the afternoon of the match, "Obviously, Steen respects the Hungarian cracks. He told me, 'This team is something special. There are 8 caps in the side and their best players are forwards, most of them world class.' It's the recognition of the tremendous potential of the Hungarian sharpshooters that has led Steen to decide on a defensive set-up for the tie." The Celtic team that lined up in Budapest on the 8th of March 1972 gives us a tantalising glimpse of what might have been if Jock Steen's carefully laid succession plans had been allowed to come to fruition, with fully half of the outfield players coming from the Quality Street gang less than a year after the final appearance of the Lisbon Lions. For the first time, Danny Mcgrain, George Connolly, Davy Hay, Kenny Dalglish and Lou Macari appeared in the same first-team selection and on the biggest stage of all. They lined up Williams, Mcgrain, Brogan, Murdoch, McNeil, Connolly, Hood, Hay, Dalglish, Macari, Lennox. Just as the teams walked out onto the pitch, a thunderstorm broke out and the rain swept down like a monsoon. Celtic had to weather a storm both over their heads and on the pitch in the opening period. The Times of the 9th of March 1972 reporting, "The 600 Scots in the 31,000 capacity crowd caught their breaths over the first 15 minutes. Thunder rolled, the rains became almost tropical, and Celtic's opponents unleashed lightning assaults. The Scots could have been excused for thinking this was to be the twilight of their gods." McNeil and Connolly held firm in that opening period. Arthur Montford reporting in the Scotsman of the 9th of March 1972 that they were cool, calm and collected everything which came their way. As Murdoch, Hay and Dalglish slowly began to exert control in midfield, Connolly continued to shine. Montford writing, "George Connolly was outstanding in attack and he gave Billy McNeil magnificent support when Uspest crowded on the pressure." Celtic were now dictating the play and creating chances. But the opener came from a bizarre own goal, courtesy of Budapest's highly rated midfielder Josef Horvath. Reports vary on what Jim Brogan was trying to do as he picked up the ball in midfield. Arthur Montford described it as a shot from far out, while Raymond Jacobs in the Glasgow Herald of the 9th of March reported the Celtic fullback pumped the ball forward hopefully. Whether a shot or a hopeful long ball, Horvath dived to clear it and succeeded only in diverting it past his own goalkeeper. The goal saw Celtic keep control of the match for the remainder of the half, although both teams might have scored before the interval. Raymond Jacobs reported, "As the rain at last eased off, Budapest recovered their poise somewhat, and only a great block by Williams prevented Benny from equalising. But just before half-time, Celtic almost scored again, Dalglish slithering across the sodden turf and just failing to meet Hood's cross shot." There are again varying reports on the course of the second half. The Glasgow Herald reporting, "As the second half moved on, Celtic continued to have matters more or less in hand. Budapest were a frustrated side and they badly needed a goal to transform their chances of saving the game." The Scotsman, meanwhile, saw it differently. "From the restart, the Hungarians mounted tremendous pressure and one of their best scoring chances came in the 60th minute. Benny headed the ball straight to Dunai, who cut between Connolly and McNeil to hit a low shot for the left-hand post. Williams seemed to have come too far out, and the ball had actually passed him when he flung himself backwards and scooped it off the ground for an amazing save." The equaliser came in the 64th minute and was a moment of redemption for Horvath, who fired a spectacular 30-yard shot past Williams to set up a rollercoaster closing period. Hugh Taylor reported in the Daily Record of the 9th of March 1972, "Suddenly, this turned into one of the greatest of all European Cup ties, a fantastic match between two superb teams. What a terrific finish! Williams was a hero in the Celtic goal, making a series of outstanding saves." Anger flared among the Hungarians as they claimed wildly for 2 penalties, but like the referee, I thought they were wild dives. If Celtic had lost the place for a spell, they quickly regained it, and with time running out, they again took command. After a sustained period of pressure, Lou Macari grabbed a sensational winner for Celtic with 4 minutes remaining. Arthur Montford described it in The Scotsman, "Macari's goal came after a series of corners on the right. The ball broke clear, but it was quickly returned from the left. Shank Mihalje palmed down a shot to Mcgrain, who was surrounded by defenders 10 yards out. Coolly, the young forward twisted left and right, swivelled until he found space, and calmly lobbed the ball over Shank Mihalje to give Celtic the goal, which should get them through to the last 4. Victory in Hungary saw hopes of a third European Cup final soaring. Malcolm Munro reported in the Evening Times of the 9th of March 1972, "What could one think about this fantastic 2-1 win on the home ground of the fancy Budapest? This was vintage Celtic. This was better than 1967, when Celtic became the first British club to win the European Cup in Lisbon. Said Steen, that team we saw there tonight, said the man who built a world-class team and rebuilt another, can do what the 67 team could, and maybe better. The man is overcautious. This present side is a better one. Do you realise most of them could still be playing in top-class football 10 years from now?" This was the salient point. Mcgrain, Connolly, Hay, Dalglish and Macari were only beginning to scratch the surface of their potential, while McNeil, Murdoch, Johnston and Lennox were all still capable of performing at the top level. There seemed to be no reason why Celtic could not remain one of Europe's top sides for the rest of the decade. The disintegration of this team, which began just 10 months later, was as devastating to those hopes as it was unforeseen. As the Celtic party departed for home after the match, their supporters based in Budapest's Gellert Hotel were having another kind of party in rather exclusive company. The hotel was designated as the obligatory base for foreign visitors by the country's communist government, so the travelling fans found themselves rubbing shoulders with movie superstars Richard Burton and Liz Taylor, the Welshman filming in Hungary while Taylor celebrated her 40th birthday that week. Gerald McNee writes in The Story of Celtic. That night is now part of Celtic folklore and provided your writer with a great scoop for his newspaper. After I had offered the famous couple 2 tickets for the match, Burton sent his black Rolls Royce, which whisked me to the film studios on the fringe of the city, where Burton was making a film with such names as Raquel Welch and Virna Lisi. It was there that he decided he would throw a party for the Scots fans, and later in the hotel's magnificent ballroom he declared, "The till rings up £5,000 before the party ends." The scenes were unbelievable. Imagine ordinary football punters from Glasgow mixing with the world's highest paid movie stars. Liz and Richard accepted Celtic hats and scarves as souvenirs and spent over an hour chatting to the mesmerised group. Burton delighted the fans by giving them a rendition of "I Belong to Glasgow" while draped in Celtic colours. Players and fans alike seemed to be perfectly at home in the most exalted company in the heady spring of 1972. Over the next couple of weeks, Danny Mcgrain retained his place in the team, turning in solid performances in draws against Aberdeen at Pittodrie and Hearts in the Scottish Cup at Celtic Park. The draw at Pittodrie, in which Celtic were clearly suffering from the after-effects of their exertions in Budapest, saw them 5 points ahead of Aberdeen with a game in hand and only 6 matches left to play. Tiredness was beginning to catch up on several players, and Kenny Dalglish was withdrawn from the Scottish League side to play England on the 15th of March. He was rested for the cup tie against Hearts on the 18th of March, while George Connolly, in magnificent form all season, also missed the match with a back injury picked up in the League International. Davy Hay took his place in defence, despite picking up a leg knock against the English League. Jimmy Johnston was still struggling to recover from the effects of chickenpox and also missed the Hearts Cup tie, but was included in the squad for the second leg against Újpest on the 22nd of March 1972. The starting lineup was the same as for the first leg, but this time Johnston and Deans were on the bench and Jinky would play a huge part in the match. The Hungarians were now hitting their stride after their winter break, while Celtic were showing signs of fatigue as the end of their season approached, and Újpest proved to be even sterner opposition at Celtic Park than they had been in Budapest. Celtic's dilemma in the return was whether to stick or twist, and Steen was well aware of the opposition's strength. He told Raymond Jacobs for the Glasgow Herald on the morning of the game, "We're not going to hand them any advantage by showing off. I hope our supporters will appreciate the situation. There's nothing the Hungarians would like better than for us to leave gaps between the outfield defence and goal. The more room there, the more space they would have to break into." As if to confirm Steen's fears, Újpest put the tie back into the balance with a goal after only 5 minutes. Celtic had started uncertainly, John Rafferty describing George Connolly in The Scotsman of the 23rd of March 1972 as unusually jittery, while Hugh Taylor in the Daily Record reported, "A strangely hesitant Celtic defence allowed the shrewd Ferenc Spenny to put a ball through the middle. Skipper Billy McNeill mistimed his tackle and the dapper Antal Dunai had all the time in the world to score a simple goal." Unnerved by this calamitous start, Celtic attacked relentlessly, but with more brawn than brains. Hugh Taylor reported, "Celtic pulled up their sleeves and began to hammer in wave after wave of mighty assaults. But this was not the Celtic the huge crowd knew and loved. This was not Celtic the polished, Celtic the poised. This was Celtic the desperate, Celtic the frantic." Újpest soaked up the pressure while looking dangerous on the break, and the crowd were becoming increasingly restless as the score remained the same by half-time. The pattern changed dramatically in the second half when Újpest seemed to have decided to hold on to what they had, their dangerous winger Andras Toth replaced by an extra defender and leaving only one player up front. It was a strange decision, as even at 1-0 Celtic would still have gone through on the away goals rule. Now Celtic took control of midfield and began to attack much more purposefully, and Lou Macari harried their defence to distraction. Malcolm Munro reported in the Evening Times of the 23rd of March 1972, "The Újpest people didn't know what to do with a little guy called Lou Macari, who, as in Budapest, just wouldn't stop running. He was saving by kicks, stopping the ball going over for a shy, chasing everything. the Hungarian defence could not have seen him far enough. Budapest were already under intense pressure when Jim Brogan was injured and was replaced by Jimmy Johnston shortly into the second half. Monroe continued, "The night was charged with tension, then with emotion when in the 53rd minute Jim Brogan was injured. He signalled to the dugout that he'd have to come off, and suddenly Parkhead erupted as Jimmy Johnston trotted out. I swear there were tears in the eyes of many as the little redhead emerged onto the field. You could see the Hungarians exchange glances and probably saying to each other, 'What the heck?' Obviously Johnston was somebody special. They'd heard about him, of course, but they hadn't heard such adulation for one small footballer." Brogan's withdrawal forced a reshuffle, with Davy Hay taking his place at left back and Kenny Dalglish dropping into midfield, Johnston forming a three-man attack with Mcgrain and Bobby Lennox. Following these changes, Celtic's performance stepped up another level. Hugh Taylor writing, "The defence steadied, George Connolly and Billy McNeill began to play with distinction, Bobby Murdoch took control in the middle. And all the while, Lou Macari was battering away non-stop at the Budapest defence." Fittingly, it was Macari who scored the equaliser on the night and restored Celtic's lead in the tie on 63 minutes, showing typical alertness to seize on his opportunity after a long ball forward from George Connolly created panic in the Budapest defence. Hugh Taylor reported, "Although it came as the result of yet another defensive slip, credit must be given to George Connolly, whose superb through ball so upset Laszlo Mora that he could only try to pass back. Intelligently, Macari had read the situation. He had run between the back and the keeper, and neatly and coolly he lobbed the ball into the net." For the second time in a fortnight, Macari had broken the Hungarian resistance, and only desperate defending prevented Celtic scoring more in the final 20 minutes. Between the two European Cup matches, they had failed to fire on all cylinders, but here they had roared back to form, and their hugely impressive quarter-final victory was won by a team that appeared to be smoothly in the midst of the transition from the Lisbon Lions to the Quality Street Gang. Exactly half of the outfield players had come from this outrageously talented reserve side, and while Billy McNeill was now at the veteran stage, Murdoch, Johnston and Lennox were still only in their late 20s. This almost perfect blend of youth and experience saw Celtic enter the semi-final draw with a mood of confidence, despite the stellar names of Ajax, Benfica and Inter Milan as potential opponents. Raymond Jacobs reported in the Glasgow Herald of the 24th of March 1972, "No matter where they have to turn next, Celtic will not only confront a club they have met in the competition before, but one who, like themselves, have won the European Cup. Celtic beat Inter in the 1967 final, and the Italian club, out of contention in this year's domestic championship and winners of their quarter-final tie against Standard Liège on an away goal counting double, might be the least of the three evils, though that is not saying much. Ajax, the holders, who beat Celtic in the quarter-finals last year and eliminated the English champions Arsenal on Wednesday, must be the most desirable of the three to avoid. And Steen has taken due note of the astonishingly wide margin of 5-1 by which Benfica crushed Feyenoord in Lisbon." Glasgow was in a ferment over the semi-final draw 2 days after the Budapest-Doza match. Rangers had also qualified for the penultimate stage of the European Cup Winners' Cup, and in a curious coincidence, both were paired with their final opponents of the same competitions in 1967. Celtic meeting Inter Milan, while Rangers drew Bayern Munich. The home ties for each would take place on the same day, the 19th of April 1972. Before that, there was plenty of domestic business still to be taken care of, including a Scottish Cup replay against Hearts at Tynecastle. But first up was a league match against Falkirk at Brockville, and Celtic would go into it without first-choice left-back Jim Brogan, still feeling the effects of the injury that forced him off the field against Budapest-Doza. At this high watermark of the season, Celtic were about to encounter the first of the great misfortunes that would so sadly characterise the decade, and the problems it would create for the semi-final preparations against Inter paled into insignificance, set beside the seriousness of the injury sustained by the emerging star rapidly making the right-back position his own. The watching Inter Milan manager, Gianni Invernizzi, learned little about Celtic, who rested Bobby Murdoch, Harry Hood, Bobby Lennox and Jimmy Johnston. In came yet more youngsters from the Quality Street gang in Jimmy Quinn, Vic Davidson and Paul Wilson to join Mcgrain, Connolly, Hay and Dalglish, with Lou Macari dropping to the bench. Closing in on a record-breaking 7th consecutive championship, kick-off had to be delayed by 10 minutes to allow hundreds still queuing outside to get into the ground, and in a frantic start, Kenny Dalglish and Dixie Deans both came close for Celtic before the game's defining moment in the 6th minute. Danny Mcgrain remembers in his autobiography, In Sunshine or in Shadow, written with Hugh Keevins, "The game was just 6 minutes old when I went for a clearance as it came out of the air, trying to instigate another Celtic attack. I distinctly remember glancing out of the corner of my eye and seeing one of the Falkirk players, Dougie Sumner, coming in to challenge. And then the lights went out." The Evening Times match report that day gives no suggestion there was anything serious about the incident, merely stating, "Mcgrain and Sumner went down after a clash of heads. Both were okay after treatment." Mcgrain was far from okay though, and the treatment he received was lengthy, both on and then off the pitch for several minutes before he came back on. He continues in his autobiography, "Recollection is hazy after that. Neil Mochan, Celtic's trainer, put smelling salts under my nose, and I vaguely recall running up and down the track beside the touchline, waiting for my head to clear. I must have felt better than I really was, or tried to show a willingness to soldier on for the team, because I came back on and actually played out the first half." To be frank, Brockville is not every player's dream ground, and as we sat in the dressing room during the interval, Lou Macari, who was the substitute that day, more or less insisted that I do a pal a favour and go back on, because he wasn't exactly thrilled at the prospect of taking my place. I tried my level best to oblige, but as I stood up to go out, the whole of Central Region seemed to turn at a 180-degree angle, and I announced to no one in particular that I was feeling very sick. It was like being in a dream sequence after that, with people's faces appearing, disappearing, and then reappearing, saying things I didn't understand. When I heard the sound of the ambulance bells, I wondered who it had been called for, and was only partly conscious when I was admitted to Falkirk Infirmary. As the stricken Mcgrain was being rushed to hospital, the match, as if it really mattered now, was poised at 0-0 at this stage, but Celtic took both points late on when two of the youngsters combined to grab a late winner. Alan Heron reported in the Sunday Mail of the 26th of March 1972, "Paul Wilson was the kid with the old head as he held the ball on the touchline, then touched it back to another who hasn't been shaven for too long, namely Vic Davidson. Keeper Ali Donaldson hadn't a chance with the 10-yard shot, which rose no more than 6 inches on its way to the net." While Celtic were moving relentlessly on in Falkirk, in Greenock, the veteran Steve Chalmers scored for Morton in their 2-1 win over Rangers, who were now 10 points adrift, having played one more than Celtic, and his old club now needed only 8 points from their remaining 7 matches, assuming nearest challengers Aberdeen won all of their remaining 5. The title race was all but done, and there were no great fears for the Scottish Cup replay at Tynecastle on Monday the 27th of March 1972. But the shattering injury to Danny Mcgrain caused serious problems for the upcoming European Cup semi-final against Inter. Mcgrain's condition was serious enough over the next 48 hours that it was considered sending him to a neurosurgical unit in Edinburgh, but he recovered sufficiently after a week in Falkirk Infirmary that he was released to continue treatment as an outpatient at the Southern General Hospital in Glasgow. It would be 4 long months before he was finally given the all-clear and was able to resume his football career. Raymond Jacobs reported in the Glasgow Herald on the 27th of March. Danny Mcgrain, Celtic's right back, suffered a fracture of between 3 and 4 inches on the right side of his skull in a head-to-head collision with Falkirk's left winger Doug Sumner. Mcgrain was taken to the intensive care unit at Falkirk Royal Infirmary for observation, and yesterday his condition was reported by John Fallon, Celtic's assistant manager, as slightly improved. This serious injury is a setback not only to the club, both in the short and long term, but is a harsh misfortune to the player who had been waiting for the chance to establish himself permanently in the senior side. When Jock Stein nominated him for the first leg of the European Cup quarter-final tie against Budapest only 3 hours before the kick-off in Budapest, Mcgrain, who is 21, took the challenge in his stride. Ironically, only last week, in the return game, Celtic lost their left-back, Jim Brogan, with a torn leg muscle. The loss of both these players has occurred less than a fortnight before the first leg of Celtic's European Cup semi-final against Internazionale of Milan. But Stein's first priority on his return from Italy, where he watched Inter draw 1-1 with Bologna yesterday, will be to decide on another full-back partnership for the Cup replay against Hearts at Tynecastle, a 43,000 all-tickets sellout. Jim Craig, just recovered from flu, returned at right-back for the Cup tie at Tynecastle, and Davy Hay filled in at left-back in the 1-0 win, Lou Macari scoring the decisive goal on 35 minutes, after which a previously hard-fought match became a cruise for Celtic. But their full-back problem was exacerbated by yet more injuries. John Rafferty reported in The Scotsman of the 28th of March 1972, "Their win could be costly in view of the European Cup tie next week. Hay had to leave the field with a damaged muscle behind the knee, and Hood limped badly. They must both be doubtful for Milan." Into the left-back position for Saturday's home match against Partick Thistle came Jimmy Quinn, while Kenny Dalglish and Lou Macari were rested. Vic Davidson scored after just 16 seconds and added another on 12 minutes to end the match as a contest before many fans had even taken up their places on the terracing. Quinn set up the third on 25 minutes, Cyril Horn reporting in the Sunday Mail of the 2nd of April 1972. "Jimmy Johnston's third goal in 25 minutes was superlative in its making and taking. Tommy Callaghan, whose first half play was the complete answer to a very critical section of the Celtic support, cleverly set up a wing run by speedy Jimmy Quinn. When the venturesome fullback's cross sailed into the penalty area, it was little Johnston who rose to bullet a header far out of Rough's reach." Jimmy Quinn, a grandson of the legendary Celtic centre-forward of the same name, was reputed to be one of the fastest players in the world. In his autobiography, Celtic's Lost Legend, written with Brian Cooney, George Connolly is quoted in conversation with Davy Hay and Davy Catanack. "The thing I discovered about Jimmy, and you're talking about his pace, see the faster a player was, the faster Jimmy could go. He could beat George McNeil likely, you know. Whoever it was, he was faster." George McNeil was a Scottish sprinter, who, because he had played football professionally for Hibernian and Morton, was denied amateur status, so could not run in the Olympic or Commonwealth Games. He was crowned the world professional sprint champion in 1972 after winning 3 out of 4 races against Tommy Smith, the 1968 Olympic 200-metre champion of Black Power salute fame. Quinn started his career as a striker, but the competition for places there at Celtic in the early 70s was intense, and Jock Stein eventually decided to try him out as a left-back, and he had made several appearances over the past 18 months without really establishing himself in the role. He now seemed set to play against Inter, but by Monday morning it was reported the selection headache at fullback had worsened further. Raymond Jacobs reported in the Glasgow Herald of the 3rd of April 1972, "The extraordinary run of injuries to Celtic players in general, and their left-backs in particular, continued on Saturday when Jimmy Quinn took a leg knock in the first 10 minutes of the game against Partick Thistle. It was small wonder that Jock Stein said yesterday, on the eve of Celtic's departure for the first leg of the European Cup semi-final against Internazionale, 'We would like to have gone better prepared.' Quinn was able to play the match out, but yesterday he joined in the intensive programme of treatment and training already laid down by Stein for David Hay and Jim Brogan, both of whom have been at left-back in recent matches, as well as Harry Hood." By Tuesday evening, it was clear that neither Hay nor Quinn would recover in time, but hope was still being held out that Jim Brogan, out injured since the second leg against Budapest, might yet make it. In a report filed from Italy the night before, Jacobs wrote in the Glasgow Herald on the morning of the tie, "Brogan was made to work harder than the others in training in today's cooler and greyer weather and will probably be ready. If not, Pat McCluskey, the only other defender left, would have to go in. McCluskey has played only one full game and half of another in the senior side, but Steen would rather field a fit, inexperienced player than one who is experienced but not fully fit. Jacobs would be proven wrong that evening when a less than fully fit Jim Brogan started the match but broke down again after 60 minutes. Still a week short of his 20th birthday, Pat McCluskey, the latest of the conveyor belt of talent but not a natural fullback, was thrown in at the deep end with half an hour still to play. The Inter of 1972, like Celtic, were much changed since the 1967 European Cup final. Helenio Herrera, architect of Il Grande Inter of the mid-1960s, had left the year after Lisbon, although he would return in 1973. They still had a few survivors from Lisbon though, including Facchetti, Burnick and Mazzola. The task facing Celtic in the San Siro was a daunting one. Raymond Jacobs reported in the Glasgow Herald of the 5th of April 1972. Inter, however, is a much tougher, in every meaning of the word, proposition than the Hungarians. They might not be quite the force they were almost a decade ago when they won this cup twice, but 5 of their campaigners from that era are still in the side: Facchetti, Bedin, Burnick, Jair and Mazzola. Their only doubt for this game is in goal, where Burden will probably play instead of Vieira, who has a shoulder injury. Facchetti has said that Celtic will not spend as much time in Inter's half as they did 5 years ago, and that is a safe prediction for the first game of a two-leg tie. Mazzola, the schemer from behind, and Boninsegna, a grittily determined centre-forward with a dangerous left foot, will have to be particularly watched. In 5 appearances in the competition, Inter are unbeaten at home, having won 16 and drawn 2 of 18 games. This is a formidable record, and they will not be scrupulous in the methods they use to maintain it, for the weight of evidence is that defeat at home is fatal in the overall result. Jock Steen's Celtic was a byword for attacking, entertaining football, and they were never regarded as particularly watertight at the back. But it would be a big mistake to say that this team could not defend. Despite being down to the bare bones at left back, and how many fans must have been lamenting the sale of Tommy Gemmell 5 months before, and without the ferocious tackling and drive of Davy Hay in midfield, their performance that night was straight out of the Italian textbook for securing a scoreless draw away from home. John Rafferty reported in The Scotsman of the 6th of April 1972. This was a drawing board performance by Celtic. Steen, according to his latest thinking, set them to defend in the middle of the field, to hold the ball there and tie up the game. This they did brilliantly, and especially in the first half. Murdoch was the key man there, but Callaghan, with running and tackling and precise passing, played above himself, and Johnston ran miles in linking the play. It was brilliant tactical work against the European game's great tacticians, and there was not a weak link anywhere in the Celtic formation. Raymond Jacobs in the Glasgow Herald of the 6th of April concurred. They marked closely, tackled quickly and largely avoided committing what is the great sin in the eyes of continental referees, taking a man from behind. The result was almost complete frustration for Inter. The second half saw Inter step up the pressure, desperate to take a lead into the second leg. But the defence held firm, even after Brogan was replaced by McCluskey. John Rafferty writing, Celtic then lost some of their elegance in midfield, but those 2 masters in the middle of the defence, Billy McNeill and George Connolly, could not be drawn nor beaten. It was one of the Celtic captain's greatest matches, and behind him the goalkeeper, Evan Williams, was safe and cool in the white heat as if it were a training session. There was no doubting which side was happier with the 0-0 draw in the San Siro. Raymond Jacobs writing in the Glasgow Herald that the 85,000 crowd started the game in an uproar of cheering and fireworks and ended it in whistling and derision. Meanwhile, John Rafferty described the Celtic manager's reaction after the match. Then came Jock Steen, grinning all over the face that had shown such strain this week as the injury problems crippled his defence. He held out his hands and cried, "There is only one word for that, magnificent!" There was no one around to argue with him. He continued, We are now in the same position as when we last drew in this stadium against AC Milan. Now we can only knock ourselves out. He was entitled to his moments of satisfaction, for he could have asked for no better result. He had played for the no-scoring draw and got it. Just 2 years after the devastating disappointment of losing the European Cup final in the same stadium, Celtic now stood on the verge of a third final in 6 seasons. Even in the heat of this moment of exultation though, it must have been on Steen's mind that the 0-0 draw against AC Milan at the quarter-final stage in 1969 had been followed by a 1-0 defeat at home to the eventual tournament winners. The job was only half done, but it was definitely advantage Celtic. The draw had been achieved with an understrength side in the midst of an injury crisis. Danny Mcgrain would not return until August, but it was to be hoped by the return leg Jim Brogan would be fully fit again and Davy Hay restored to the team. Despite their continuing injury worries, by the time the second leg came around on the 19th of April 1972, Celtic had clinched their 7th consecutive championship and reached the final of the Scottish Cup for the 4th time in succession. Pat McCluskey played in all 3 matches of this run, while Vic Davidson and Paul Wilson both scored in a 3-1 win over Kilmarnock at Rugby Park on the 8th of April, before the Ayrshire side were beaten by the same scoreline at Hampden in the Scottish Cup semi-final 4 days later, this time with the older players, Jimmy Johnston and Bobby Murdoch in particular, excelling. The title was clinched with a 3-0 win over East Fife at Bayview Park on the 15th of April, with 2 goals from Dixie Deans and 1 from Harry Hood. Jimmy Quinn returned at left back for the title clincher, but the only cloud on the horizon was the continuing absence of Jim Brogan and Davy Hay. The season had been one of transition, but it had been a smooth one, and this was very much on Jock Steen's mind as the return with Inter approached. Raymond Jacobs wrote in the Glasgow Herald of the 17th of April 1972. On a wall in the boardroom at Celtic Park hangs a photograph of the players who swept all before them in the 1966-67 season, culminating in the European Cup triumph in Lisbon. Of that staff of 29, only 9 are still with the club. Yet on Saturday, Celtic were able to wrap up a record 7th consecutive league championship, with 4 games still to play. That item on a crowded agenda having been passed only 3 days after Celtic had won through to the final of the Scottish Cup, Jock Steen, the guiding hand behind the multiple successes of the last 7 seasons, yesterday took time to reflect on this latest achievement. Interrupting the supervision of preparations for Celtic's attack on yet a 3rd competitive front, Wednesday night's return game of the European Cup semi-final against Inter Milan, Steen was quick to pay a tribute to the contribution made by the survivors from the first years of what has been unbroken success of one kind or another since he took up the reins. The young players we've brought in this season have been rightly praised, he said. But what would we have done without the experience of the older ones? Bobby Murdoch, Jim Craig, Jim Brogan, Bobby Lennox and Jimmy Johnston have all played their part, and perhaps most of all Billy McNeil, who has been captain all these years, probably a record in itself, and who has had a magnificent season. Turning to the semi-final, Jacobs reported that a decision would be made that day on the fitness of Hay, Brogan and Harry Hood. Hood had played the 90 minutes on Saturday, but had not looked fully fit. All 3 stayed behind while the rest of the 20-strong pool headed for Seamell on Monday morning. One player who did travel was Danny Mcgrain. Jim Blair reported in the Evening Times later that day. The inclusion of fullback Danny Mcgrain is typical of Steen. The player, who is making a splendid recovery from a fractured skull, has no chance of playing, but goes to Seamell knowing he's very much part of the Parkhead first-team plans. Despite their injury worries, Celtic were favourites going into the second leg, and Inter would be without their main striker, Roberto Boninsegna, who scored for Italy in the 1970 World Cup final against Brazil. Both the Glasgow Herald and the Scotsman predicted a Celtic win, and both made much of cryptic comments by Jock Steen about the role to be played by Jimmy Johnston. Johnston will have an important role. I have not yet told him what he has to do. He'll get a surprise, and so will they. Steen was also cagey about his lineup, suggesting there could be a few surprises. He was quoted by John Rafferty in The Scotsman of the 19th of April. "Maybe we will not start with our best 11. We might put players in to run the legs off them, and then bring on a couple of men to take advantage of the situation." It was speculated that Johnston might not start, but Steen's words tie in with an incident remembered by Dixie Deans, who had yet to play in Europe since signing in December 1971, in his autobiography There's Only One Dixie Deans, written with Ken McNabb. "The day before the game, Jock read out the team and my name wasn't on it. I was on the bench. You were only allowed one sub back then, and I was seething. This was the biggest game of my life. I was scoring goals for fun, and yet the boss didn't trust me. At least that's the way it looked to me, with the job of scoring the goals that could take Celtic into the final. I came away from that team meeting as low as I had ever felt before a match. My stomach was in a knot, and my temper was at boiling point. I then decided to do something I'd never done before, confront Jock and demand an explanation. I should say this took balls, because Jock's word was law. You didn't question him if you wanted to hang on to your goalies. But I reckoned I had nothing to lose. The conversation went something like this. "Mr. Steen, can I talk to you?" I could tell right away he wasn't interested, as he didn't even break his stride to look at me. "What is it, Dixie? I don't have time." "I want to know why I'm not playing." This blunt remark must have got through, because he suddenly stopped in his tracks. At that point, he stopped walking and looked me right in the eye, and I waited for an ear bashing. "Dixie, I'm hoping to win the game with you. You're going to win us the game." I could hardly believe what I was hearing as the gaffer explained his thinking. "They're going to come and they're going to play a tight game. It's all they know, but this time we'll be ready for them. And I'm going to bring you on, and you're going to win the game. You'll be the match winner, the hero. Just wait and see. Trust me, Dixie." Suddenly, I went from being hobbit-sized to someone who felt 10 feet tall. That was the Steen effect. I never met anyone who could pump you full of self-belief. You would run through walls for Jock. His pep talk convinced me I was Celtic's secret weapon to pull off an Italian job, Dixie the super sub. Any nagging doubts I might have had about his decision were instantly banished, and I went away convinced I would be Celtic's match winner. Deans' story lends an extra air of poignancy to the eventual outcome of the tie, as Celtic fell agonisingly at the final hurdle that stood between them and a third European Cup final. In front of 75,000 raucous fans, they lined up: Williams, Craig, McCluskey, Murdoch, McNeil, Connolly, Johnston, Dalglish, Macari, Callaghan, Lennox. The second leg of this European Cup semi-final became one of Celtic's most frustrating nights. Inspired by the majestic Bobby Murdoch, they hammered relentlessly at the Inter goal, but all to no avail. The typically well-drilled Inter defence cut off the supply to Jimmy Johnston, enabling them to strangle the forward line. John Rafferty reported in The Scotsman of the 20th of April 1972, "Murdoch was a magnificent player, a master in midfield, authoritative, inventive, inspiring, and that was a fine start for Celtic. But Johnston was forced out of the game, and in that, Celtic's defence opener was blunted. A hard little man, Oriali, trailed him all over the field and hardly let him see the ball. Macari, Lennox and Callaghan went at that formidable defence persistently and courageously, but it would have taken Johnston at his best to pull them out of their well-practised formation. Facchetti marshalled them with dignity, and the sturdy Burnick, the free man, cleared up the loose trouble." Lou Macari remembered the robustness of the Inter approach in his autobiography, Football My Life. "I couldn't believe how aggressive the Italians were in defence. You don't see it much these days, even from Italian teams. If you went here or there, they followed you. If you went to control the ball, there would be a foot in behind you. In those days, you would accept a tackle from any angle. There was none of this no tackling from behind nonsense. If you weren't tackled from behind, it would be a surprise. There was nothing between the teams. It just didn't go for us on the night." Without creating many clear-cut chances, Celtic kept up a constant pressure on the Inter goal. Raymond Jacobs in the Glasgow Herald of the 20th of April reported, "They put on the tremendous and constant pressure that was expected of them, and on innumerable occasions, Inter's goal enjoyed hair's breadth escapes. The danger came mainly from Celtic's right side. Johnston moved to the left wing, taking Oriali with him, and with Facchetti always shadowing Lennox, the space thus left was exploited by Murdoch and Craig. Murdoch was at the heart of almost every move Celtic made, and the packed house was in full throat as Celtic swept imperiously forward, hammering at Inter's door and doing everything but burst it open. They moved impressively, always excitingly, and sometimes brilliantly. In a 15-minute spell in the first half, Dalglish had a header saved, Johnston hooked a shot over the bar from close range, and a Jim Craig shot was turned over the bar by a fingertip save from the keeper. Perhaps the best chance of the night fell to Tom Callaghan after Macari flicked the ball into his path with a clear sight of goal, but he couldn't control it in time to keep his shot on target. Into the second half, only the width of the woodwork kept Inter level, although it would have been an own goal. Raymond Jacobs reporting, "At the start of the second half, when Connolly burst through for the first time, Burnyk almost put through his own goal, the ball bouncing off the crossbar. But after that, Celtic lost the impetus that had carried them so close so many times before, and against the man-to-man marking of Inter, the rhythm left their game. All this time, Williams had not had a solitary save to make, but only Murdoch, probing for gaps in Inter's dense defence, was able to find space and time to move." As promised by the manager, Dixie Deans was introduced as a substitute for Kenny Dalglish with just under 30 minutes remaining of normal time, but the pattern remained the same, and the 30 minutes of extra time was played out in a tense, almost surreal silence. John Rafferty reported, "The 90 minutes were played with Williams as spectator, and then they went into extra time, and that was grim. Celtic still attacked, but there had to be a safe edge to their every move. One goal was going to settle it, and they all knew that. Even the crowd were hushed. The time for encouragement was past. Praying was in order." The match is, of course, best remembered for the penalty shootout, the first time a European Cup tie had been settled by this method. Raymond Jacobs wrote in the Glasgow Herald, "As anyone must agree, such a method of deciding so important a contest is patently unsatisfactory." It was also, and very unfairly, a career-defining moment for the unfortunate Dixie Deans. After Sandro Mazzola scored for Inter, it was Deans who was sent forward to take Celtic's first spot kick. He remembers his confidence evaporating as he made his long, lonely walk from the centre circle to the penalty spot in There's Only One Dixie Deans. "I had already decided to tuck it into the bottom right corner, and nothing in these 33 steps had made me change my mind. I turned away, took a short run and struck the ball. At the last second I saw the keeper dive to his left just before I hit the ball. The movement happened in the blink of an eye, but it was enough to convince me to change my mind at the last possible second and aim to lift the ball off the ground. The contact was good, I struck it well and the keeper was beaten, but the ball flew 6 inches over the bar. 6 inches? No more. That was the difference between fame and infamy. If you listened to some folk, you'd have thought I'd missed by the proverbial mile. The thing is, the ball was rising all the time, and that made it look worse than it was. But it doesn't really matter, does it? I'd missed. I'd missed. I'd missed." Deans was the only one of the 10 penalty takers who failed to convert, although Evan Williams got 2 hands to Inter's second penalty, but not enough to stop it going in. It's interesting to see the other takers for Celtic, Deans being followed by both fullbacks, Jim Craig and Pat McCluskey, Jimmy Johnston and last of all Bobby Murdoch, who had to take Celtic's 5th kick despite Inter's last penalty, putting them in an unassailable position at 5-3. McCluskey put his away with aplomb, showing remarkable composure for such a young player in such a high-pressure situation. Deans was devastated by his miss, despite reassurances from manager and teammates that he wasn't to blame for Celtic's exit. Still coming to terms with it all, he was approached by a pressman in an Italian restaurant the following night and talked into giving an interview, then agreed to be photographed outside beside a bus stop. The photo appeared in the Scottish Daily Express the following day with the caption, "Dixie Dean's the loneliest man in the world." That defeat to Inter Milan was hard to take. By the narrowest possible margin, Celtic had gone out at the semi-final stage without conceding a goal over 210 minutes of football. Obviously Celtic had not scored a goal in that time either, and it's difficult not to wonder what might have happened had Tommy Gemmell not been sold to Nottingham Forest or John Hughes to Crystal Palace a few months earlier. Inter were the undisputed masters of defensive football, and Celtic had been unable to find a way through the massed ranks of their rigorously well-drilled rearguard. It's not fanciful to suggest the sheer power and unpredictability of Hughes or the thunderous shooting of Gemmell might have made a difference if they had been available. It wouldn't have been the first time Gemmell had broken down their resistance. Despite the disappointment, no one thought for a moment in April 1972 that Celtic were in decline or that their days as serious contenders for the European Cup were over. Davy Hay, the oldest of the Quality Street gang, was still only 24 and hadn't been available for the semi-final ties. They were barely beginning to fulfil their potential, and only the finest of margins had taken Inter into the final. In an interview with the Daily Record on the 18th of February 2015, the day Ronnie Dyler's Celtic played Inter Milan in the round of 32 of the Europa League, Lou Macari looked back on that semi-final tie. "Obviously we were disappointed to go out, especially in that manner, but nobody thought back then that we had blown a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We'd reached the semi-final of the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1966, won the European Cup the following year, lost in the final in 1970 and were beaten by Ajax in the quarter-finals in 1971. Obviously, losing in 1972 was a blow, but our attitude was, well, there's always next season. We expected no less than that, so it didn't seem like a great what-if moment. As it happened, Celtic were to be cheated by that disgraceful Atletico Madrid side in the semi-finals in 1974, and that was the end of an era." Speaking 43 years after that fateful evening, Macari gave no indication that the Inter Milan semi-final was a game-changer for Celtic. But as we shall see in the next episode of this series, for the player personally, it had made all the difference in the world. For Macari's strike partner, Dixie Dean's, a moment of redemption awaited in the Scottish Cup final of the 6th of May 1972 against Hibernian. Celtic's record-equalling 6-1 win over Hibernian that day might not seem like too much of a surprise to modern-day fans. This was, after all, a European Cup semi-finalist against a team who have enjoyed only sporadic cup success in the intervening half-century and with a reputation for Hibsing it on the big occasion. But Hibernian then were an impressive side and had beaten Rangers 2-0 after a replay in the semi-final. They had top-class players like Pat Stanton, John Brownlie, Eric Shadler and Arthur Duncan, who all won international caps for Scotland at a time when they were very much more difficult to come by, as well as other impressive performers such as Alex Edwards, Jimmy O'Rourke and Alan Gordon. A very close match was predicted, and the Daily Record on the morning of the match asked for predictions from a player from each of the 16 First Division clubs. The players were evenly split, 8 forecasting a Celtic win, while 8 plumped for Hibernian. The latter number included 3 players who later signed for Celtic and who could never be portrayed as anything other than Celtic-minded. Kilmarnock goalkeeper Ali Hunter was quoted, "Celtic played excellently against us in the semi-final at Hampden, although I go for Hibs. They are in the right sort of form at the right time." Hibernian manager Eddie Turnbull had signed Steve Murray for Aberdeen when he was the manager at Pittodrie. Murray was quoted that day, "Hibs have Eddie Turnbull spurring them on." Meanwhile, young Clyde midfielder Dominic Sullivan stated, "Hibs are the form team at the moment." Raymond Jacobs' match preview in the Glasgow Herald was fairly typical. "No one should expect the teams to attack in reckless fashion. They will spar cagily in the early stages, mindful that a mistake could cost them dearly. Overall, I expect Celtic, with their vast experience of the big occasion, to have the edge, and to retain the trophy, by the narrowest of margins. Davy Hay and Harry Hood both failed late fitness tests and Celtic lined up for the final. Williams, Craig, Brogan, Murdoch, McNeil, Connolly, Johnston, Deans, Macari, Dalglish, Callahan, sub Lennox. The pre-match predictions of a cagey affair were proven wrong when Billy McNeil opened the scoring after just 2 minutes. But Hibernian were quickly level when Alan Gordon scored on 12 minutes. Thereafter, Celtic turned in an awesome display, once again inspired by the magnificent Bobby Murdoch. John Rafferty reported in The Scotsman of the 8th of May 1972, "The simple explanation of Hibs' defeat is that Bobby Murdoch established himself as boss of the midfield. He ruled that area with the haughty majesty of a ringmaster, bringing order to it and sending out his acts to delight the audience." Dixie Deans put Celtic ahead again on 23 minutes, but they were only 2-1 ahead at the interval. The demolition was sparked by his second on 54 minutes, an effort that was named by Scotsport in December 1979 as Scotland's goal of the decade, and of which written descriptions can barely do justice. After this, there was no coming back for Hibernian, and after Deans completed his hat-trick, Lou Macari added 2 of his own to match Renton's 6-1 win over Cambuslang in the final of 1888, when they had been captained by one James Kelly, who went on to join the newly formed Celtic a few months later. The only sad note that weekend was the announcement of the departure of Jim Craig at the end of the cup final. A fixture in the side since January 1967, Craig was the latest Lisbon Lion to leave the club, and just a week after his 29th birthday. Giving his birthday as the day after the match, Sandy Beveridge wrote in the Daily Record, "Jim Craig yesterday spent most of his 29th birthday preparing for his departure for South Africa in 8 days. And as he made his arrangements, the soccer world was still recovering from the shock announcement made right after Celtic's 6-1 cup final win over Hibs that Craig would never play again for the Parkhead side." Craig described the match as a very emotional experience. He went on, "It was a wonderful way to end my career with Celtic, and I only count myself lucky that I was with Celtic at such a momentous time. I am thinking about all the many great players, much better than myself, who have been at Parkhead and won little, while I have many honours. Undoubtedly, the greatest of those was the European Cup win over Inter Milan in 1967. So a career that started late when Craig signed for Celtic straight from university in 1965 ends prematurely, with his career in dentistry taking him away from the sport he has graced for 7 years. But Jim will still be playing soccer. Craig said, "I have been thinking of this move for the last year. I made inquiries about this job in South Africa, and it was only afterwards that the news came of the offer to play for Hellenic. Celtic have been very good to me in giving me a free transfer, but then I would have never have wanted to play for another team in Scotland in any case. It is the way I would have wished it to end, playing for Celtic." That apart, the season had ended on a high note, and while the disappointment of defeat in the penalty shootout to Inter was still raw, praise was being heaped on Jock Stein's new-look Celtic. Hugh Taylor wrote in the Daily Record of the 8th of May 1972, "The special magic that has made Celtic Britain's best and certainly most spectacular team in the last decade won the Scottish Cup final against Hibs at Hampden. Something special. That really is Celtic." One of the great what-ifs of Celtic's history is what might have happened if Danny Mcgrain and Davy Hay had been available against Inter, and what if Tommy Gemmell or John Hughes hadn't been sold a few months before. Looking ahead, Mcgrain and Hay would both be fit again for the new season, and their prodigious talents could be brought back into a team that was virtually untouchable in Scotland even without them. A great deal of optimism, rather than gloom, surrounded the club at the end of season 1971-72. It wasn't all downhill from the European Cup final in Milan in 1970, and the trajectory of the club was still pointing upwards in the summer of 1972. But things were already happening behind the scenes that would come to a head in January 1973 and set in motion the ultimate disintegration of the second great team that Jock built.